For over 3,500 years, Indigenous nations engineered more than 2,000 clam gardens on Canada's Pacific coast. Complex stone terraces that produced 4 times as many butter clams and twice the little neck clams as untouched beaches, sustaining entire ecosystems without collapse. Yet within one lifetime, this infinitely regenerative food engine was uprooted by colonial law, disease, industrial dredging, and a ban that erased its memory. How did a system that endured millennia vanish in just 80 years, and can rediscovering its secrets change our future? Stretching along the ragged coastline of what is now British Columbia, more than 2,000 stone-walled clam gardens lie hidden at the water's edge. These are not scattered relics or accidental formations. Each one was built with purpose, claimed and tended by Indigenous nations, Coast Salish, Weewai-Kai, Haida, and Kwakwaka'wakw, whose roots in these territories reach back thousands of years. On Quadra Island, archaeological teams have dated one clam garden to at least 3,500 years before present, anchoring the timeline of this engineered seascape deep into prehistory. The sheer number of gardens, over 2,000 mapped so far, with many more likely lost to time, signals a coordinated effort on a continental scale. Generations of families moved boulders by hand, stacking them at the lowest tide lines to shape entire shorelines. These gardens transformed the intertidal zone into a living infrastructure, not only feeding communities but supporting dense populations and vibrant cultures. The vastness of the network hints at the scale of knowledge and cooperation required, raising a single question. What kind of food system needed this much deliberate engineering, and how did it endure for millennia? At the edge of the retreating tide, stone walls rise in silent lines, tracing the lowest reach of the sea. These walls are not random piles, but the result of careful calculation, built at the precise point where the water falls away only during the lowest astronomical tides. Each boulder was moved by hand, sometimes weighing as much as a person, and set with others to form a barrier that would hold back the beach itself. Over time, these walls trapped sand, gravel, and broken shell, transforming steep or rocky shores into broad, flat terraces. The new land behind the wall became a perfect habitat for clams, with just the right mix of oxygen, moisture, and stability. Placement was everything. Too high, and the sand would dry out. Too low, and the clams would suffocate. Generations learned to read the tides, returning year after year to add stones, repair damage, and extend the wall as the beach grew. The work was communal, carried out at the rare moments when the tide pulled farthest from shore. Those hours might come only a few times each year. These walls are evidence of a deep understanding of both place and process, a kind of engineering that relied not on blueprints, but on memory, observation, and collective labor. In the space between land and sea, Indigenous knowledge shaped a living infrastructure, one that could last for centuries if cared for, and that would soon reveal its true abundance. Measured side by side with untouched beaches, clam gardens produced results that defy modern expectations. Field surveys on Quadra Island and across the coast found up to 4 times as many butter clams growing in the terraces behind these ancient stone walls. Little neck clams, another staple, reached double the abundance and grew nearly twice as fast. The numbers are not just impressive, they are consistent across sites and seasons, pointing to a system that multiplies food with every generation of care. But the abundance did not stop with clams. The engineered terraces became nurseries for crabs, sea cucumbers, whelks, chitons, barnacles, mussels, and even small fish weaving through strands of kelp. Researchers cataloged a living mosaic, rocky reefs on the wall and sandy flats behind, each supporting its own community. The more these gardens were tended, through digging, returning shells, and aerating the sand, the more productive and diverse they became. This is not a story of extraction, but of a human ecosystem partnership, where every act of stewardship brought a measurable return. The result, a food engine tuned over millennia, delivered reliable yields and supported entire coastal societies without collapse. Radiocarbon dating and optically stimulated luminescence have placed the construction of Quadra Island's oldest clam garden at a minimum of 3,500 years before present. These findings are not isolated. Across the coast, teams led by archaeologist Dana Lipovsky have used stratigraphic sealing, sampling shells and sediments locked beneath undisturbed stone walls to confirm ages spanning millennia. Drone-based photogrammetry combined with ground control points has mapped more than 800 wall segments, cataloging their precise elevations and tidal positions. The agreement between radiocarbon and luminescence dates, tested at multiple sites, rules out accidental formation. GIS inventories now document over 2,000 distinct gardens, each one a deliberate act of engineering. No evidence of boom and bust cycles appears in these records. Instead, the scientific consensus points to a system that remained productive and resilient across centuries of changing climate and population, its abundance directly tied to ongoing care. Within a single generation, entire villages along the British Columbia coast fell silent. Epidemics swept through, beginning with smallpox in the late 1700s and again in 1862, killing as much as 90% of some indigenous communities. The Haida, Kwakwaka'wakw, Coast Salish, and Weewaikai lost not only family but the elders and knowledge keepers who understood the cycles of tide and sand. With each wave of disease, clam gardens were left untended. Beaches that had been shaped by thousands of hands became abandoned. Colonial authorities soon forced survivors from their ancestral shorelines, relocating families to inland reserves far from the sea. Stewards were cut off from the very places that had sustained their people for millennia. The chain of care that kept clam gardens thriving was broken, not by neglect, but by a shock that emptied the coast of its caretakers. In the absence of those who knew how to tend them, the ancient food system began to slip from living memory. In the late 19th century, a new chapter began on the British Columbia coast. Colonial authorities, looking to profit from the region's natural resources, introduced the first commercial clam canning licenses. By the 1880s, permits for industrial-scale harvesting were issued to canneries and entrepreneurs, granting legal access to beaches that had, for thousands of years, been carefully managed by Indigenous families. These licenses were more than pieces of paper. They opened the shoreline to extraction on a scale never seen before. Provincial archives record the earliest permits in 1888, with government inspectors cataloging clam beds and approving applications for commercial use. The system that had once relied on generational stewardship was now subject to quotas, fees, and distant oversight. Licenses legitimized the removal of vast quantities of clams for export markets, setting the stage for an industrial boom that would soon transform the coast. In a matter of years, the legal framework for sustainable, place-based management was replaced by a regime built for speed and volume. Between 1882 and 1963, the coastline of British Columbia became a testing ground for industrial ambition. Commercial clam canneries, once limited to hand digging, began deploying mechanical dredges, machines that raked and tore through ancient clam beds with relentless efficiency. By the early 1900s, fleets of dredges scoured the intertidal zones, stripping away not only clams, but the carefully engineered terraces that had supported them for thousands of years. Catch records from this era tell the story in numbers. Annual landings soared into the thousands of tons, only to plunge within a few decades as wild stocks collapsed. Habitat surveys from the 1920s and the 1930s documented beaches transformed from living ecosystems into barren flats. By 1963, the devastation was so complete that authorities imposed a sweeping harvest ban north of the Broughton Archipelago, citing the rise of dangerous biotoxins and the near absence of recoverable clams. In less than a century, a food system that had endured for millennia was undone by 80 years of extraction and mechanized destruction. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency enforces industrial food safety standards designed for factory-scale operations, not for hand-dug clams from ancient gardens. Every wild clam harvested for sale must pass through certified depuration plants, undergo biotoxin testing, and be processed in federally registered facilities. Those requirements demand hundreds of thousands of dollars in infrastructure. Most clam gardens fall outside CFOA approved growing areas, making their harvest illegal for anything beyond personal use. Provincial rules mirror these barriers, adding layers of licensing and closure zones that keep traditional harvest off the market and out of community feasts. Meanwhile, Fisheries and Oceans Canada writes Indigenous clam gardens out of the official record, dating the start of Canadian shellfish farming to the 1920s and omitting thousands of years of managed abundance. These policies do not just block revival, they erase the evidence of a food system that once fed entire nations. On the beaches of Fulford Harbour and Russell Island, the work of rebuilding clam gardens is underway. First Nations and university researchers move stones, monitor tides, and track clam growth, determined to restore what was nearly lost. But every step forward meets a wall of paperwork. Field teams must navigate a maze of permits, environmental assessments, and licensing requirements that can stretch for years and drain limited budgets. Projects are delayed while applications sit in government offices, waiting for approval to move a single rock or plant a handful of clams. Even with evidence of success, including higher clam densities and revived ecosystems, restoration remains locked behind costly regulations. The people who once shaped these shores now find themselves negotiating with agencies for the right to care for their own beaches. The struggle to revive the gardens is not only a matter of science and tradition, but of persistence against a system that still holds the keys. Today, modern fisheries teeter under climate stress, while clam gardens, once erased by law, prove their resilience through restoration. This isn't just history, it's a blueprint for food security. The future of coastal nourishment may depend on remembering what industrial progress tried to bury. What lessons do we choose to restore?